You can gain appreciable muscle with a vast array of loading ranges, 3 to 5 reps up until 30 plus reps. Ultimately, as long as you're training in relative close proximity to failure, you can train across a wide spectrum of loading ranges. We carried out a study and trained subjects, and half of them puked, and they were in 25 to 35 repetition range.
Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, one of the world's leading hypertrophy researchers and a voice who's changed how we understand muscle growth, Brad has built his career on proving what truly drives progress: effort, evidence, and the relentless pursuit of adaptation.
If somebody told me you do 6 sets, 8 to 12 reps, tempo doesn't matter, and you take 2 minutes between sets because less than 2 minutes is not beneficial for hypertrophy, to be honest with you, that's as precise as I wanted to get.
Where do you see the future of the fitness industry going?
The biggest advancements will be
In today's Hack You episode, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, a global recognized authority in muscle hypertrophy and resistance training. He's a tenured professor of exercise science, author and researcher. He has published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers, maybe even the most peer-reviewed papers in the industry in regards to hypertrophy. His work on training volume, frequency, and effort has changed how athletes, including Mike Thurston, has changed their daily workout routines. And he continues to debunk myths, or as he calls, let people know that maybe thinking for themselves sometimes is necessary.
So Brad is someone who I've been well aware of ever since I got into the whole fitness scene. And to be honest, it's one of the people who I would always go to if I ever had a question about anything relating to the gym and building muscle.
Brad, given his vast knowledge and incredible amount of data, in today's episode was able to precisely state the preferred amount of sets per muscle group per week, the repetition per set, the reps in reserve per set, the importance of tempo, if at all, and the ideal rest in between sets. And as a bonus, he even said how your training routine could look like to get the most efficient result out of it for hypertrophy.
So Brad, thank you very much for coming on the show. You are someone who I've wanted to speak to for the longest time. You are the literal OG when it comes to the knowledge of building muscle and hypertrophy. I don't think there's anybody else who knows as much as you. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, which we're going to have. And just so you know, back in the day when I first started to get into this scene and when I became a personal trainer, the first textbook that I bought was the first copy of your Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy. And that it's a heavy one. It's a very in-depth one, but it was one of the reasons that I was able to continue to learn and progress with all of my knowledge, which I've acquired so far. So I'm looking forward to this.
Well, thanks, and that's nice to hear.
Good stuff. I think there's a lot which I want to go through. To begin with, I think one thing which a lot of people tend to debate about at the moment is optimal volume. And there's a graph which I remember in your book. It was the relationship between volume and hypertrophy and the inverse U curve, whereby there's the optimal amount of volume which people should be doing. How can people try to achieve that optimal level, and what are the things they need to watch out for?
Yeah, so it's a hypothetical optimal because there's a high inter-individual variation between your responses to volume. There is some other variables as well. But it seems particularly with volume, there seems to be a fairly wide array of different responses, people's responsiveness. And it's really a nuanced question that when we look to have everyone wants a cookie cutter answer to a question like that, like a certain number of sets. But this really will vary based on multiple factors. First of all, multi versus single joint exercise, the effects on your body are going to be different in terms of the systemic fatigue and other factors. The proximity to failure involved with these sets, the distribution between muscle groups and the ancillary work that muscles are getting. So anyway, multiple considerations to try to oversimplify a topic like this. The general literature seems to show somewhere like an inflection point somewhere on 10 sets overall for all the muscles per week. 10 sets per week per muscle. But that can vary, and it doesn't have to be a constant. This is something, again, that people, I think, very, very much misinterpret, that it doesn't have to be constant where every muscle group gets the same amount of work. There is at least a decent rationale where you can do specialization cycles, apportion more work to lagging muscle groups, and then take away and less work for stronger, more well-developed muscle groups. So these are all things that I think need to be considered. And I will say, as far as the figure in the textbook you're referring to, interestingly, there has not been, well, conceivably there is this inverted U response where beyond a certain point, you're going to start to see a regression in results, likely from overtraining, or non-functional overreaching. That's never been demonstrated in the literature. Now, I will say that the literature really has not examined very high volumes for all the muscle groups. And I mean, I think it's just logical at a certain point, if you're doing 5-hour-a-day work, whatever it is, I mean, just huge amounts of work every day, at some point there will be an overtraining response. But the human body seems to be more resilient than people give credit for. And where that overtraining response is more than a lot of people think.
Mm.
But
I think
there certainly will be a plateau. Whether you end up getting the regression, that is where I think it's been somewhat overstated. Contrary to what I thought, that was my original hypothesis, that you'd see this kind of inverted U. And in all the literature we have, given the volumes that have been studied, there's been no regression.
Yeah, I think it's something you've said before, where I guess it really depends upon what the goal of that person is. So there might be an individual who wants to look good, they want to build muscle, but they have lots of other things going on. So really, they want to go to the gym. They want to get jacked, but they want to minimize the fatigue so that they can also do other forms of activity or whatever else they've got going on. But then there are other individuals, for example, Mr. Olympia competitor, who would not care about anything else, but their sole focus is to be as jacked as possible. So for them, there doesn't seem to be too much of a regard of necessarily overtraining or worrying about fatigue, because they only have one focus. And if doing more volume means getting a little bit bigger, then that payoff is worth it.
Correct. Everything is a cost benefit. And to your point, I was specifically referring to your question. I thought it was posed as to optimal. I thought the question was specifically as what is optimal for a given individual. And that's going to vary too. Some people will need the 10 set or so inflection point. It's not like everyone 9 sets, you're not there, and then 10 sets. No, it's on a continuum. Some people might need some more, some less, and can be up to 20 sets. So the literature has not been able to provide really hard figures on this. And I don't think it ever will, just given the inter-individual variability and other factors I mentioned earlier. But I'll also say this, for the vast majority of people, you can gain appreciable muscle that probably is satisfactory for the goals of the vast majority of people with a minimum dose, somewhere around probably 4 to 6 sets per muscle, perhaps even slightly less. But I would say a good gauge would be somewhere around 4 to 6 sets per muscle per week. And maintenance can be done with less. Once you get to a certain point, for most people, you can maintain, 2, 3 sets potentially.
When we talk about those 4 or 6 sets per muscle, just from the audience perspective, the question would be, what is the rep range and intensity of those sets that you would recommend?
Intensity of effort? You mean how close to the proximity to failure? Well, loading, so this is another hobby horse topic of mine as far as loading, because when I went to school, it was always taught that if you were training with light loads, anything over like 12 to 15 reps, basically you're doing glorified cardio. You might as well just be doing spin cycle. And the abundance of literature now really, in my opinion, this is the one area that the evidence is just conclusive, that you can gain appreciable muscle with a vast array of loading ranges, between 3 to 5 reps up until 30 plus reps, and at least get similar whole muscle hypertrophy. There may be some differences, and I'll get to that in a second, between fiber type responses. I think that that's equivocal based upon what we know now. Some evidence indicates there may be an effect, some doesn't. But ultimately, as long as you're training in relative close proximity to failure, you can train across a wide spectrum of loading ranges. And to your question as to failure, the literature doesn't show that failure is obligatory, that you have to do it. But you have to be close, relatively close, at least for a majority of sets, some of the sets. So I would say somewhere you need to be within a RIR of 2 repetitions in reserve, where you couldn't get more than 1 to 2 reps, let's say. We actually just recently published a study showing that segmenting RIR over time, going from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 in a periodized fashion, did not compromise gains compared to just doing 1 RIR over the period. So I think that needs further exploration. But getting back to the loading ranges, I would say that given that there are certain things that suggest training throughout a spectrum of loading ranges may optimize. And again, for the vast majority of the general public, I don't think it means anything. You're someone who just wants to gain some muscle, gain some strength. Training in whatever your preferential loading range is fine. I'll also say this, that training with very high reps tends not to be very fun. We carried out a study and trained subjects on the topic, and half of them puked, and they were in 25 to 35 repetition range. During the first week, they adapted to it, and by the time the study was over, they were. But it's just not. There's a lot of acidosis that's involved in that type of training. But given the potential for different hypertrophy of fiber types, type 1 with higher reps, type 2 with lower reps, like I said, there's equivocal evidence that may be the case. And there's also some factors. Training with heavier loads does optimize strength. You can gain strength with lighter loads, even in trained subjects. Maybe not in elite powerlifters, but in the majority of trained subjects, that is the case. But you're not going to optimize strength. So again, you might have benefits for doing some training with higher reps and some with lower reps. I will say also that probably the majority of training should be done within a 6 to 12, 6 to 15 rep range, just because it's more efficient and less onerous. Training with high reps, like I said, has some negative perceptual effects on your pain discomfort threshold. So.
Yeah, now, from my experience, I've tried both. After reading, obviously, your book, I would alternate the rep ranges and sometimes change it from time to time based on the exercises which I'm doing. And obviously, I saw progress. Then I saw a load of people come out fairly recently in the past year who were bashing high rep sets. So basically anything above like 8, 9, or 10, they were saying, oh, don't do that. It's like not necessary. So I was like, okay, let me give this a try. So I eliminated all rep ranges basically like above 10. Did I see much difference? I definitely felt as though I got stronger, but that makes sense because I was doing more sets in a lower rep range. But I feel as though there were certain muscle groups that maybe started to lag because I wasn't doing the high reps which I was doing before. For example, like doing a lateral raise, like just doing a heavy lateral raise, as heavy as possible for like 6 to 8 reps. I just don't like, I don't know whether it was just me in my head thinking that, but I felt as though it's not quite doing the same in comparison to doing lateral raises for like 15 repetitions, for example.
Yeah, there may be inter-individual responses. Here's what I will say. People that have very strong opinions on this topic are not evidence-based. They're not, either they're just trying to get a platform on social media, or they're just not adept at understanding the literature, because any conclusions to the contrary can't be drawn from the literature we have. And to the contrary, there is some evidence. We do have several different forms of evidence showing that combining rep ranges may confer a benefit. So am I highly confident that's the case? No. But I think there's really no downside other than if you don't like doing it, then all right. But if you're a bodybuilder who wants to potentially get every last morsel of muscle their genetic potential can acquire, I think it's a worthy goal, a worthy way to train.
And Brad, you're one of the things you're most famous for, Dave, you've probably, if not the most peer-reviewed studies on muscle hypertrophy. And from our perspective, we need those studies because there's so much information out there that, as you said, is very, very subjective or motivated to sell courses. So what are some of the myths that you were able to debunk because of the studies that you did that you would like for people to know more about?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, I don't want to say that we debunk the myth, because debunking myths requires a body of research. You don't publish one study and a myth debunked. You need multiple studies to provide substantial evidence. And I have colleagues certainly that have done a lot of great evidence. But one of the myths, quote unquote, that's been debunked, we just covered, is that that light load training doesn't promote hypertrophy. That's glorified cardio. That has not been shown to be the case. The other work that we've done, like nutrient timing, again, it's not that nutrient timing doesn't, quote unquote, may confer benefits, but that if it does, any benefits that it confers likely are very slight. We've debunked when I say we have, multiple studies have debunked the claim that training with very short rest intervals maximizes hypertrophy because of the acute hormonal response that you get, the elevated acute systemic response post-exercise. And if anything, somewhat longer rest intervals probably are better for hypertrophy, as opposed to 30 seconds to 60 seconds, which jack up your testosterone after training. I mean, we can go on and on. I know you have other questions, but and again, when you say debunked, here's another thing that I think it's important. A lot of times, research doesn't necessarily debunk a topic, but it casts doubt. It gives reason where you have less confidence in something that has been claimed in the past. I think there's a lot more uncertainty, and certainly in my view, things that I certainly thought had greater certainty before I was as conscious a researcher as I am. I've gotten dumber as the time has gone on in terms of my certainty.
But the nutrition periodization that you mentioned, so which one should we then apply to?
Nutrition periodization?
In terms of, food intake, in terms of at what point we should have the food intake to create muscle hypertrophy, what would be the ideal timing then?
Well, if you're talking nutrient time, from a nutrient timing perspective, the classic nutrient timing paradigm was that you needed to get nutrients, particularly protein, but protein and carbohydrate together because they had a combined anabolic effect within 45 minutes or so after a workout. If not, you start going straight catabolic, and that nutrient timing was more important than the quantity and quality of the foods that were consumed. This has been debunked. That certainly just has no credence. Might there be a benefit to taking in protein, particularly protein and carbohydrate to a lesser extent? From a muscle building standpoint, if you're training fasted, certainly there is a benefit to getting protein in more quickly after a workout. But I will say this, muscle is sensitized to anabolism for more than 24 hours post-workout after an exercise session. So you're always going to be in a quote-unquote window. And food is the thing. Food is anabolic, so particularly protein. So after a protein-containing meal, you stay anabolic for 5 to 6 hours, depending on the like if you're taking whey protein alone without any other foods, but then it's going to be shorter because it's a fast-acting protein. But if you're consuming a mixed meal, let's say eggs and oatmeal in the morning, where you have delayed entry through the gut, you're going to delay the gastric digestion is going to be delayed for 5-6 hours of nutrient absorption in that time as well. So anabolism will be consistent across that period. So if you're eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and you're training anywhere within that window, you're always going to be, quote unquote, within that window. So it just basically makes it moot to get quick protein in. I'll also say this, if you're a bodybuilder, it's not going to hurt you to take in protein immediately after a workout. So might it confer a very slight benefit? We can't rule that out based on literature we have. This is where, again, everything comes down to cost benefit. I think for the vast majority of people out there, it's just going to be moot. Unless you're training fasted, where I do think there's some added need to take in nutrients more quickly. And carbohydrate, by the way, the only time that really matters is if you're doing 2-a-day workouts, because basically the theory behind glycogen depletion is two. One, that it regulates insulin function post-workout, and not just an insulin function. Number one, it's not anabolic, it's anti-catabolic, and protein has insulinemic effects. So basically you already are at your insulin levels, your maximal endogenous, meaning within the body, insulin levels just by consuming protein after a workout. So it's not going to have the anti-catabolic effects or mood. And from a glycogen repletion standpoint, this is where it gets a little hazy. So there is increased glycogen repletion as far as the rate, how quickly you replete glycogen. So after a workout, you're going to use glycogen, especially if it's a moderate to higher rep bodybuilding style workout. If you take in carbohydrate immediately post-exercise, you can substantially increase the rate of repletion. It's only going to matter, though, if you're doing, let's say, a workout a few hours later, like a 2-a-day, the old Schwarzenegger type workouts. Then it may have, and particularly for the same muscle group, because glycogen depletion is muscle specific. So if you're doing back in the morning and biceps in the afternoon, there could be a reason why you should have quicker glycogen repletion. But if you're consuming carbohydrate throughout the day, by the next day, glycogen repletion will be the same whether you took it in immediately post or delayed consumption. So again, it's really mood and it is somewhat context.
Could you talk a little bit about tempo? Because I don't know if there's been a few studies which have come out recently that have shown that whether you're using a very slow tempo or a faster tempo, it doesn't actually have that much of an effect on building muscle tissue, which is quite interesting because I mean, throughout my years of training and coaching, I changed things up a little bit when once upon a time I started experimenting with a couple of Ben Pakulski's training programs, and he would have like these 4 or sometimes 5-second negatives on some of the exercises. Now, it was something which I'd never really done before, but I felt like it was such a change up to what I was doing previously and a very much a different stimulus, as there's much more tension applied for longer, well, not more tension, but the tension is applied for a much longer period of time, that the working sets and the reps were taking much longer than usual. Of course, I felt like there was more soreness after that. I did feel like I saw some initial progress, but I don't know if it's the slower reps actually meant that I was thinking more about what I was doing. And then, you know, I was engaging the target muscle more so than I was doing before. But to clarify for those people, when they go into the gym and they're thinking, should I follow a specific tempo when I'm doing this exercise, or should I just focus on executing the movement as best as possible whilst trying to lift as heavy as I possibly can do?
Yeah, interesting question. And we just published a meta-analysis on this very topic. Meta-analysis is the pooling of all the results on a given topic, where you look at the literature and you are able to gauge, basically making one big study out of all the studies on the topic. And short answer is there's really very little to no effect of, or minimal effect of tempo within given limits. So it's only we only were able to gauge within basically 1 to 4 seconds or so, concentric and eccentric. There is some evidence, we weren't able to meta-analyze this, that super slow training when you're doing like 10-second up may have negative effects on hypertrophy. It could be either something inherent in the exercise or maybe just that you're not able to engage the muscle mentally as much. I don't know. Again, this is where we don't have enough evidence to really, in my opinion, give a draw a strong conclusion on that. But within wide limits, so 1 to 4 seconds or so, which is a fairly wide range of tempos, concentric and eccentric, very little difference. There seemed to be on the concentric a somewhat small benefit to somewhat faster tempos, although I'm not sure how much we can make of it because there isn't that many studies. At this point, there aren't that many studies on it. There's more on eccentric tempo. As far as eccentric tempo, it's kind of interesting because it somewhat surprised me. Now, I would have thought that somewhat slower eccentric tempos may confer benefit. And to your point, just novelty. Look, novelty does tend to drive adaptations. The body responds to novel stimuli. So it's possible that, like when you're giving an anecdote like that, that the novelty of that exercise, you're a well-trained lifter, and that may have spurred some additional growth over a short period of time. It's impossible to know. What I would say, given the evidence, though, is that, and this is I'm giving my own opinion here, even though there is no benefit to a slower, quote unquote, slower eccentric tempo, I think you need to make sure you at least control the eccentric tempo. Because the joints, when you're lowering the weight, gravity is pulling you down, and the joint is under increased stress. So if you're just I see people in the gym and they're doing like lawnmower repetitions. And, at the bottom of that repetition, the joint is put in a position, particularly if you're doing somewhat heavier loading, where there can be issues, joint-related issues. So I would suggest at least making sure you control the load. I also think just from the standpoint of ensuring muscular tension on the negative, that is the case. And I'll finalize by saying that I think tempo is somewhat moot on an overall context, but I will say that I am still of the opinion, and this is based on limited evidence, that having a mind-muscle connection may enhance the effects of training. We do have a decent amount of EMG evidence, so acute muscle activity evidence on this, showing that you can target a muscle better by having a mind-muscle, by thinking about where the muscle that you're training while you're doing it. There's a paucity of controlled research on muscle hypertrophy. We carried out a study that was conflicting. It seemed to show an effect on the biceps, but not the quads. And we can speculate on reasons there. But anyway, I don't think there's any downside to it. And I think that there is at least a potential upside. So rather than thinking about how fast or slow you're going, I think just focusing on the muscle will take care of the tempo.
Can growth occur on the eccentric phase of the movement? Or is it predominantly the concentric?
Absolutely, it can. There was actually a fairly recent study that showed that the majority of growth occurred on the eccentric. I'm somewhat skeptical. Again, this is where replication needs to come into play. But there are different actions, and there's good evidence that the eccentric and concentric components activate different signaling pathways. So conceivably, when I talk about signaling pathways, that is how muscle protein synthesis occurs. It occurs through different anabolic signaling pathways. So conceivably, having multiple pathways that are activated may have a convergent effect, a synergistic effect on hypertrophy. These are all things that need to be better studied, but the limited evidence that we have certainly shows that both eccentric and concentric actions by themselves produce hypertrophy, and that conceivably it would be an additive stimulus of doing both. And by the way, but also mention some other interesting evidence shows there may be site-specific differences.
What do you mean by that?
Can hypertrophy regionally, where like the distal, the lower portion, there's some evidence that the portion of the quadriceps closer to the knee, that's called the distal portion, gets greater hypertrophy from eccentric exercise on the midpoint, the mid belly of the muscle, so higher up, gets greater stimulation and greater hypertrophy from concentric action. So again, more complete development may be achieved by the combination of both as well.
So for an advanced lifter, then you would argue it's worth doing assisted reps. In other words, when you've reached concentric failure, someone assists you, and then you just take the negative, and then you go again and again until you can't slowly let the weight down again with the negative.
So there is some evidence. I think of all these specialized techniques that are available: drop sets, supersets, rest pause training. Accentuated eccentric overload training has probably the most evidentiary support. Now, it's not going to be huge differences, but again, I think for advanced lifters, it's a decent strategy to consider. I would also caution to be somewhat conservative in the use, because overdoing these types of things, especially eccentric training, a lot of it does enhance muscle damage. Now, there is what's called a repeated bout effect, so over time that shouldn't have much, if any, effect. But I think that, again, overdoing some of these high intensity type of strategies may facilitate a non-functional overreaching, maladaptive states.
I mean, we talked about the advanced lifters. I think for the audience, from application perspective, we know now the set range, the rep range, the reps to failure range, the tempo application. But if a person has, say, 3 sessions a week, so 3 hours a week, what would be the most efficient way to train for maximum hypertrophy in those 3 hours?
Yeah, I mean, I think a total body workout 3 days a week works really well. But this other street, you could do Monday lower body split, Wednesday upper body split, and then total body on the final day. So it just depends how you want to structure training. I think, look, adherence is the most important thing, particularly a bodybuilder. You could tell a bodybuilder to do anything, basically, and then you could tell them to eat grass, and that's going to get them jacked, and they'll go out and they'll be sucking on the lawn. But for the general gen pop, time and adherence are of the essence. And I think the most important thing is having an enjoyable workout. So changing things around, I don't think keeping it constant. People tend to get stale with that type of, there's a boredom effect that sets in. So kind of changing things up in cycles. Training over 4 to 8 week cycles, and let's say you might do total body every day, then you might do upper lower split on Monday, Wednesday, and then a total body, and you might then do push pull legs on another cycle. I don't think it really matters in that context, but training a few, getting a decent. I mentioned the minimum effective dose of training, which certainly can be accomplished. You could probably get a little more in it that period of time. You definitely can. Again, making sure that you're hitting all the major muscle groups. And I would also say focusing, especially if you're more advanced, and if you're more advanced and your goal is maximal hypertrophy, because if your goal is strength or power or other things, then you're going to have different training strategies. But if your goal is maximal growth, maximal hypertrophy, assessing your body and then specializing, having portioning volume to areas that are less well developed and regressing it, taking volume away from areas that are more developed, I think is a sound strategy.
In your opinion, what would you say is the most overrated exercise and the most underrated exercise?
I don't go down those roads, because I think exercises, and again, you'd have to also you're talking about for hypertrophy, because exercises are
hypertrophy, yeah.
Like, when you say overrated, there are things that I probably wouldn't do if purely hypertrophy is your goal. I wouldn't be doing a Turkish get up. It just is not a hypertrophic type of exercise. But I think that this is these are clickbait type social media posts. They make really good fodder for getting interaction on social media. But there is no best or necessarily worst exercise. You need to consider the applied anatomical effects of exercises. So you don't want to do, if your goal is shoulder mid-delt hypertrophy, you don't want to just do a shoulder press. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing shoulder presses, but shoulder press is more of a frontal delt movement. So you're going to need to do an abduction exercise, whether that is a dumbbell lateral raise, cable lateral raise. They're all potentially viable. Now, could one be more? I've been partial to like cable work because they give more constant tension. We just published a study showing dumbbells and cables have very similar effects in trained individuals on hypertrophy. So I think largely it comes down to preference. Availability, of course, is going to be a factor. I love the lateral raise machine. If your gym doesn't have a lateral raise machine, it doesn't matter how good it feels, you're not going to be able to do the exercise. So I think just focusing on some variety. I think there's good evidence that having some variety in your training is important, making sure you're covering all the muscles, because muscles have varied attachments and functions. So you want to make sure that you are working muscles, proper points of movement, from different angles, and considering their taking biomechanical considerations into account.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to me how, I don't know when this came about, but all of a sudden it was all of the hype in the fitness industry that training or overloading the muscle in the lengthened position was what you should be doing. In fact, some people are saying, oh, you should no longer, if you're, for example, if we take the lateral raise, probably one of the best exercises to talk about. If you're doing a dumbbell lateral raise, at the top of the movement in the shortened position, that's when the load, or the resistance is the highest, if we're looking at the strength curve. Whereas in comparison, if you're doing a cable lateral raise, then the resistance would be at its peak in the lengthened position. So because everybody was making this big deal about how you should be training the muscle in the lengthened position, for a period of time, I just stopped doing dumbbell lateral raises because I thought, well, this is just ineffective in comparison to doing a cable lateral raise. But then new studies have come out which have shown that it, once again, doesn't really make much of a difference. You should just do both.
Yeah, so now that's somewhat of a different, really now you're talking about range of motion, not a type of exercise, but as a best of overrated. So when you're talking range of motion, that is a nuanced topic. So there is quite good evidence that doing partials in the lengthened position for at least the vast majority of exercises that have been studied, which is somewhat limited, shows better hypertrophy than just doing it in a shortened position. And what that would indicate is that making sure you are not just doing a shoulder press like this, in the upper position, that you need to make sure you are traversing the lengthened position, and that conceivably has greater hypertrophic effects than the lockout. Now, with that said, doing full range of motion, we've published several studies on this, does not seem to be much benefit of lengthened partials over full range of motion. But on the other hand, lengthened partials show as good hypertrophy as doing the full range, which again would suggest that the more important position, if you will, of the range of motion would be the lengthened position. Now, when it comes to exercise selection and whether, like, you're talking dumbbells versus cables, the study I mentioned, we looked at that, dumbbell laterals versus cable laterals, and we didn't find any difference. However, there have been other studies showing that leaning back in a leg extension, so basically increasing the leg, basically you're stretching the rectus femoris to a greater extent. So if you do, instead of having a 90-degree angle, you go to a 40-degree angle where you recline, produces greater hypertrophy in the rectus femoris, which again gives credence. There are some exercises, and by the way, similarly, doing a hamstring exercise in a 90-degree angle has greater effects on the hamstring development than doing it lying down, because again, you get a greater stretch in the hamstrings when you are seated, doing a seated leg curl than a lying leg. So don't necessarily dismiss, I would caution against dismissing that. I just think it's more nuanced. We also do not have studies. You can't generalize to all muscle groups. So the delts, maybe it has to do with the deltoid in that respect. Again, I can't say. But the vast majority of research we have on the topic is with the quads and the biceps and triceps. So the extremity muscles, calves as well. The calves, by the way, it seems particularly effective to do the lengthened partials in that particular benefit. So it could, again, be more muscle specific. The research in this topic is pretty much in its preliminary stages, I would say, and that we just have a lot more to understand before we can draw strong conclusions.
One of the statements that you made that got me very excited, because there's a lot of people in my life that are not as Mike and me, who are in the gym 6 times a week, was a statement that weightlifting has much more benefits or longevity benefits, even besides the hypertrophy aspect and the muscle building aspect. And if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, what all the benefits are, so we can get our parents and the people we care for that are not as eager to be in the gym every day a little bit more active.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I will say that the muscle building itself generally has a positive effects on your health. So muscle can be considered a metabolic sink. So basically, glucose is stored within muscle, and if you have a small sink, you're going to be able to store less glucose. Larger muscles give a bigger sink. You have more capacity to store glycogen, carbohydrate, and thus it diminishes the potential for insulin resistance and diabetes. Kind of important. And to that effect as well, resistance training, I don't know how deep you want to get into this topic, but kind of simplified, it wakes up these what are called glucose transporters that are in the muscles, GLUT4 transporters, that basically they're chaperones that bring glucose into the cell from the cell receptor. And it wakes them up so that they are more active in taking glucose into the cell. So again, enhances metabolic health. Resistance training, of course, increases strength. A loss of strength decreases your functional capacity, has huge effects on not only the longevity you have, but the quality of life. I mean, basically, people are dependent on others. They lose their physical independence, have to go to a nursing home, skilled care facility when they're older. So having the ability to carry out functional tasks, and to that effect, it also reduces the risk of falls, particularly can induce hip fractures. And a hip fracture in an older individual can be serious. It can lead to death, huge morbidities and death in very short periods of time. Muscle also secretes what are called myokines. They're not only effective within the muscle, but they actually secrete these myokines outside of the muscle, so in an endocrine fashion, circulatory system, and they have positive effects on chronic inflammation on multiple organ systems, so on other organ systems. Resistance training, now it's not as robust an effect as aerobic training, but it does promote cardiovascular health, depending upon how you're carrying it out. Even respiratory health can be affected. So brain health, big effects on the brain. There's various cytokines and other substances that are produced during resistance training that are thought to have effects on the brain, and certainly just the effects of mental health that's been studied on an overall basis have been shown consistently with resistance training. So in my humble opinion, it is the most beneficial, and I'm not saying that other forms of exercise aren't beneficial or even complementary. I think certainly doing some aerobic training along with resistance training will enhance the benefits. But I think overall it gives the best bang for your buck on a general basis for overall health.
For those people who have taken a period of time off from training, whether it because they might have had an injury or an illness, or maybe they're just being straight up lazy, is there such a thing as muscle memory, where they go back into the gym and they have an ability to put muscle back on quicker than they did previously?
Yeah, it's unquestionable that is the case. And there's two primary factors. One is what's called motor memory, which is just having a mental connection to the neurological system, neuromuscular system, with the movement pattern. So you're able, when you guys think back to when you first started training, if you can, you're very uncoordinated in many of the movement patterns. Even machine-based exercise, which kind of lock you in, you're still trying to figure out how to smoothly press the weight. Whereas that comes back very quickly. The motor patterns tend to be ingrained. But there's also muscle memory in the form of cellular memory. And that has this can get very technical, so I'll try to keep it simplistic, but some evidence suggests that there is a cellular memory for your myonuclei. So there's something called satellite cells, which are muscle stem cells, which donate nuclei. The nuclei produce, they're kind of the brains of the cell that transcribe proteins that are ultimately translated into muscle proteins. And increasing the number of nuclei in the muscle gives you basically a production factory for proteins. Think of it like a plant that's producing proteins, not a plant, a production plant. So you have a greater ability to produce more proteins. Well, there is some evidence that you retain those nuclei even after you stop training. So even as the muscle atrophies, the additional nuclei, by some studies, show that they are retained. Now, I will say there's conflicting evidence on this. So there's some evidence showing that that is not the case. And, I would say that my confidence in the topic is modest. But there's other evidence, which I think is more robust, that you have what's called an epigenetic memory, meaning that these certain processes within the cells are upregulated and they stay upregulated so that the next time when you come back to training, and this can last for fairly long periods of time, if you stop training and you come back, the muscles are in a more heightened, have a great and heightened sensitivity to get back what they had before, and even potentially the greater sensitivity might even enhance the effects, which is a hypothesis I think that's kind of interesting, that if true, it might give credence to short periods of desensitization, like active recovery and then retraining again. That's something I think that needs further study, but probably doesn't make any sense for the majority of people. But if you're a well-trained athlete,
if you remove the injury risk for somebody who's a little bit older, let's say 50, 60 plus, would there be any other adjustments, or would there be any adjustments to compared to a training program for a 25, 30-year-old?
Yeah, so that's always going to be specific to the individual. So again, making it general, I can make some generalized statements, but it's not like there's older people and younger people and they all respond the same, obviously. So if it's someone like me who's been training my whole life versus someone who's never trained, that's going to factor into big effects on training status. I will say this, generally speaking, as you get older, your recovery tends to diminish, your ability to recover. So usually you're going to have to start being more judicious with volume, the frequency of training. But there's going to be an interaction and conceivably as well with your intensity of effort. There's going to be that interaction, volume, intensity, frequency interaction. You need to be more mindful of that. Whereas things that when I was 20 that I was able to recover from really easily, I'm not able to do that anymore. So I've gotten older, I've been more judicious in my prescriptions there. For some people, now, often is the case that joints become, you get joint issues. Osteoarthritis becomes much more prevalent for a lot of people as they get older. So training with having at least more training towards lighter loads often has a beneficial effect. You at least need to be cognizant of joint health to a greater degree. Now, look, young people, they can have injuries that affect joint health. So particularly in athletes who've been injured, etc. So it's, again, that's why overgeneralizing can be dangerous. But I think those are some general things to at least consider.
When it comes to recovery, as of today, what would be some of the variables or the data points that would you look forward to, and from a priority perspective, that would indicate you are recovered and you can continue again?
Yeah, I think the ability to maintain or increase loading over time, hopefully overall increasing it, but having performance increases. Now, look, as you get more and more well-trained, those performance increases will come much more over a much longer period of time. So basically what's showing you're over that you're not properly recovered is that you start seeing performance decrements. If you're seeing no increases, I mean, that can just be a function of being really well trained and, over short periods of time. So it can take, in some cases, a couple of months to start to see smaller increases. They start coming less and less frequently.
Where do you see the future of the fitness industry going? I mean, if we a little bit more specific and we talk about people who are going to the gym and wanting to get bigger and stronger, do you feel like we will be doing the same thing in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time? Or do you think that there will be some sort of shift or change in our approach to training when more studies come out, or our ability to do studies just get better overall? Do you think it's going to be very similar, or do you think there will be changes?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's going to be anything that's mind blowing. We have the basics of how to train. What we're doing now is to fine tune. It's more is getting optimization strategies for the general public. We have a pretty damn good idea. Doing basic workouts is going to get most people the results they want. So what we're talking about is optimization for those who want to maximize their hypertrophic potential. What I will say, I think where the biggest advancements will come, and this will happen at some point, I don't know when, but will be the ability to use genetic profiling to optimize programming prescription for a given individual. Because that's where, research can only provide a general guideline for the basically it's providing a mean. So we provide generalized recommendations. Everyone becomes their own N=1 experiment. They have to ultimately figure out what works best for them within the given framework of the evidence that we have. I think at some point, and hopefully that's going to be within the next years, the way technology is going, maybe even quicker, that we'll be able to have a better ability to target the individual, looking at gene profiling, to be able to say, hey, look, you need higher volumes, you need lower volumes, you need more reps for this muscle group. Again, I can't say specifically how that will play out, but I think there is a good reason to think that will provide us with better ability to prescribe individualized workouts.
Brad, thank you. I know we're tight on time today, but I wanted to appreciate the time we spent and the knowledge that you shared. One question for the audience: what's the best way to stay in touch with you or to follow you and follow your insights for the future?
Yeah, I just say Google me.
Old school. OG. Brad, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Learned a lot.
Thank you. And if you're a personal trainer or looking to get into personal training, I highly recommend getting the textbooks. That is definitely somewhere where you need to start.